Welcome to the Bird's Eye View. This series is not meant to be a political or cultural commentary, nor is it a nitpick or comprehensive review. What we will be doing is diving into entertainment to try to understand its message, how well it accomplishes this, what we can learn from it, and how it might be improved. So let's look into it. Today, we're going to take a look into She-Hulk, and better yet, what we can learn from She-Hulk. First, we'll look at the quality of the writing. Then, secondly, we're going to look into the message itself, what we can learn from what it is really trying to say. Then, lastly, we're going to take a look at what it says in actuality. Sometimes the intention of a message is different than how it appears in the story itself. First, a quick look at the message itself and the quality before we jump into what we can learn. First, as far as the message goes, She-Hulk is mainly about the idea of the perception of others, taking that and then defining who we are, and not really being able to be our full selves to others, but instead being only a shallow version of what other people perceive. It is about feeling forced into a box, into a role that's not your own, and never truly getting to be yourself with other people, being known by others, but also being able to accept your full self, just as she struggles with being She-Hulk because she still wants to be just Jennifer. Now, secondly, as far as the quality goes, there were a lot of great ideas that were nested inside of She-Hulk. However, there were some very big flaws. First and foremost, it self-contradicts itself. It is so much about perception, seeing people for who they really are in their full, whole selves, and yet we don't really get a chance to see people that way. They don't show us who She-Hulk really is under the surface, who the secondary characters are. Also, the climax really leaves a lot more to be desired because the villains were not truly set up. It sets up Intelligentsia, and yet we don't really get to see her confront them. And the people she does end up confronting weren't set up to begin with. If the writers and Kevin were really the bad guys, then they should have been foreshadowed earlier on. Those are some of the big issues with the quality and the overall message. However, what can we learn from these issues and from She-Hulk itself? I think most importantly, the creator should live up to their own expectations. I think a great example of this idea outside of She-Hulk is the movie Cuties. Now, I will not show any footage of that, of course, because I don't want to go into that territory. However, the idea behind that movie, if you watch it, if you listen to the story behind it, was about how objectifying children is wrong, and how the idea that people would use that and think that way, especially children themselves, is a really harmful, terrible idea. Now, that, of course, was nested in exactly the problem, objectifying children. And so it totally contradicts itself, leaving people who watch the movie feeling dirty and everyone hating it because it contradicts itself. And I think you can see that same problem to obviously a much lesser degree in She-Hulk. How it talks so much about perception, about how she feels like no one really wants her as Jennifer, as someone who is more fully herself, who she really thinks of herself as, and yet we don't really understand who Jennifer is outside of the She-Hulk character. So based on this, what can we learn? I think the biggest thing we can learn from She-Hulk is to uphold your own message. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you're writing a story, let's say you're writing it about the fundamental goodness of humanity. If you write a story like that, do not show every character, for instance, to be fundamentally evil, to do terrible evil actions, for people to be backstabbing and killing other people. Why? Because this totally undermines the integral message that you're trying to come across. In so doing, She-Hulk does the exact opposite of that by showing every character in such a two-dimensional light and not giving us more of a three-dimensional view of who they really are as a person. So the first lesson that we can learn from She-Hulk is, from a writing standpoint, you need to uphold your own message. If you're talking about the fundamental goodness of humanity, then show the fundamental goodness. If you're talking about the evils of religion, then show that. That is not to say you can't show the opposite or make a little balance, She-Hulk could have had two-dimensional characters, but having the main character be two-dimensional and not showing her in a deeper light, that undercut the whole story. Now, secondly, on a more human level, what can we learn from the message? I think there is this trap in human psychology where we tend to look at people and think we know all there is based upon how they appear. And I don't just mean how they look, but also how they dress, also how they act, their mannerisms. So the very surface level details, we tend to think, as humans, we already understand who they fundamentally are. And She-Hulk does a good job of commenting on how this makes someone feel, and how this can make someone feel like they're on the outside, that they're not truly understood, that how they appear is all they are. Something that makes She-Hulk unique is that we see the inside of this rather than the outside. I think in many properties, you see the opposite side. It's the main character having to learn about some side character, or even the villain, having to see what it's like to be in their shoes, to understand them more deeply. But in this case, it's the opposite. It's the main character dealing with that struggle of being otherized and being seen as only a small part of who they really are. Based on this idea, there are two different ways to approach the lesson. The first way is from the outside, meaning as the person who isn't otherized, we need to take a look at who people really are under the surface, to withhold our fundamental judgments. It's one thing to have a certain idea about someone based upon their appearance, based upon some surface level details. We have to do that as humans, but instead of making that all they are, from the outside perspective, we should have the patience, the understanding to wait a little bit and try to get to know people more deeply. But from the inside perspective, if we're that person, we need not to just take it. Something we learn from She-Hulk is when she just takes it, just complains, just deals with it, it hurts her. It only makes her life worse and worse over time. And she ends up going through, as far as a mental health standpoint, she goes on somewhat of a spiral until eventually hitting her breaking point on several different levels. Well, first, she kind of broke a little bit when it came to the boyfriend that she had that broke up with her. But the real breaking point was when they had, we'll call it the intimate tape. When the intimate tape was shown at her dinner, that was when she really hit this breaking point. And what do we see there? Well, we see the conflict, the clash of perception of who she is buttoned up, and then seeing who she is behind the scenes. Now, from a quality standpoint, we talked a little bit about that when we discussed the quality. However, from a lesson standpoint, from the message, what can we see here? Well, we can fundamentally see that just sitting back was not good enough. That just letting people judge you or put you in a box was not good enough. The true change in her character and in the show was when she confronted the writers, when she confronted those who put those expectations on her and took charge of her own story. So what can we learn from that? Well, sometimes when we're the ones being judged, it is necessary for us to confront them, to not let people tell your story, but instead to take charge, to tell them it's not okay, and then to boldly tell your own story, regardless of how other people might think or feel, to go forward telling your own story. Now, lastly, what can we learn from what it actually says? That is, from how the message really appears in the show itself. There's the intention and then there's the reality. Well, in reality, there are two different things that we should be learning from the message on a more human level. And the first one is, we need to be willing to accept all of ourselves for who we are. Jennifer has this struggle, and you see this at the beginning, where she rejects She-Hulk completely. She rejects this part of herself, and I don't think the story itself does a good job of commenting on this rejection. Instead, at the end, it somewhat tries to wrap it up in a bow, and I think falsely. It could have taken another episode, or frankly just a rewrite, to try to truly say the fuller story, and that is She-Hulk should have truly accepted that she was Jennifer and She-Hulk, that she was both at the same time, that in order to be seen for all of who she is, she needs to see those aspects in herself first. If others are going to accept you, you must first accept yourself, or that should at the very least come hand in hand. But the last part is, there should have been more emphasis on accepting others as well. Now, I get that she is dealing with not being accepted, but think of the ways that she could have accepted others. That she could have truly learned to see someone, even someone like Matt Murdock, if they had another episode or two where they could focus on that relationship, trying to model that she internalized that lesson herself, that she had to work on seeing others. So if we're going to learn from what it actually says, what's the lesson then? Well, the lesson is, if you want others to see you, you need to accept yourself. If you want others to understand who you are, you have to understand yourself. But furthermore, you have to understand others. It goes hand in hand, understanding yourself and understanding others. And this is a balance that we have to play, where She-Hulk really emphasizes only half of the equation. It's missing the other half. And if it had added more or done some rewrites or tweaks, it could have done a better job of showing this lesson. And it's a lesson we all need to learn. And that is, if you want acceptance, you should accept yourself and accept others. So this has been a look at what we can learn from She-Hulk on a writing level, what it actually intends to say, and then what it should have said, or what it says in actuality, meaning in reality, what is the greater lesson we can take from it and that we can try to apply to our lives. Now that I've gone over that, in the next video, we're going to look at how we could rewrite or tweak the story to make the message far more powerful. So I'll see you then.